This episode of ChatGPD was made possible by the hard work and creativity of our production team. A huge thank you to Chris Sang, Alakia Chandran, and Shakoyak Forazan for their expert production, editing, and behind-the-scenes magic that brings each conversation to life. We also want to thank Saratoga and the IMS for their support in helping us share ideas, stories, and resources that empower our grad students at every stage of their journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of ChatGPD, our podcast on careers in biomedical science. My name is Pamela Plant and I'm the Director of Graduate Professional Development here at the Institute of Medical Science. I'm joined today with my guest, Liam Kaufman, who is the Executive VP of Product and Academic at Cambridge Cognition. Welcome, Liam.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And I think we're going to start off by diving right into what your role is.
For sure. So just to give some context, the company that I work for, Cambridge Cognition, sells computerized cognitive assessments and voice assessments. And we primarily sell them to pharmaceutical companies, biotech, life science companies for clinical research. But we also sell them to academics as well. So the sort of two parts of my role, one is the academic role, so running the academic side of the business, so selling assessments to academics for research. And then the other side is figuring out what type of products we want to build for all of our customers, and also helping day-to-day with commercial deals, helping with long-term strategy, things like that.
So it sounds like a very multifactorial, multidisciplinary
Absolutely.
job.
Yeah.
And could you maybe break that down for us a little bit, like on what a typical week looks like? What kind of things are you doing and engaged in?
Yeah, for sure. So the company that I work for is based in the UK. So the mornings are usually pretty heavy with meetings, and then the afternoon is a bit more opportunity for me to do independent work, learn, et cetera. So day to day, we do, as I said, a lot of deals with pharmaceutical companies, and there's typically quite a bit of work up front before we actually sign the deal. So often the scientists at the pharma company want to figure out which tools or which measures should be included in their trial. And so they talk to a number of different companies like ourselves. And so the scientists that I work with will present data for a specific therapeutic area. And then there's back and forth on the protocol. And if they want to work with us, then we do contracting with them, et cetera. So I'm involved in that process, both to support the scientists and to support the salespeople. And then once the trial starts, then it's usually clinical operations that take over and kind of run the study. But more broadly, part of my role is to think about what we should be building next to ensure that we can stay competitive, we can solve the problems that our customers have. And so it's really important that I have that opportunity to work with customers up front, and then also throughout the trial as well. And then pretty frequently I go to conferences, scientific conferences, both to meet with our customers, but also even to meet with competitors to kind of get a better handle on what they're working on. So those are some of the things that I do day to day.
It sounds like you really have a foot firmly in science and one in business as well. And I'm going to rewind a bit because you are an IMS grad. Can you talk to us a little bit about your time in IMS and what your journey was like getting to where you are now?
Yeah, for sure. So I was working with a cognitive neurologist at Sunnybrook. And the specific research that I was engaged in was looking at eye movements, sort of a gauge for cognitive impairment, specifically executive function in people living with dementia. And so it was sort of an early digital biomarker, and it was an interesting way of gauging behavior in a way that wasn't typically done. So that was some of the work that I was doing, and during that process, I was actually learning how to code to analyze some of the data that I was collecting. And I became really interested in sort of that data analysis side, programming, computer science. And there was one evening I remember where my supervisor, who was absolutely amazing, but she was a clinician, and so she worked long hours. And so I typically met her at like 9:30 at night. And I had a program advisory committee meeting like the next day. And so I met with her and she gave me a lot of constructive feedback. But I realized I had, hours of work ahead of me to prepare for this important meeting the next day. And so I think after that, I did a bit of soul searching. Like, is this what I want to do? What is the probability of getting a job in this area? What do I like doing right now? And also it's, entrepreneurial interest. And so I ended up making this decision of not proceeding with the PhD, just doing a master's. And my supervisor, she was like incredibly nice about it. Like she actually was worried that I might have like mental health problems. So we had a good conversation about it. My wife also worked in the same lab at the same time. And so she actually went over to my wife and like, is everything okay with Liam? And then once we kind of got over that, we figured out how to complete the master's, what I needed to do next. And she was supportive of things that she could do to help me kind of transition into computer science. So that was sort of the initial journey. I ended up doing a totally unrelated educational technology company that was launched in 2012, around then. Sold that a few years later.
So you launched that yourself.
Yeah.
You went right from your master's, started your own business.
So I actually went from my master's to an undergraduate degree in computer science.
Wow.
And that was a challenge for me because I wasn't particularly good at math. And comp sci at U of T is pretty math heavy. So I went back to like the public library and took out like a grade 10 textbook and went through it in a couple of weeks, and then did the same with 11 and 12. So that when I started, I was sort of at a similar level to like the 17 and 18-year-olds sitting next to me. And like being an older student was actually an advantage because I worked hard. I was attentive, and I was definitely pretty motivated at that point in my life. And so by the time I'd finished my computer science degree, I had those practical skill sets and a better vision for what I wanted to do next. And so that's when I created this startup. Because it was 2011, people had smartphones, or were starting to have smartphones in class, and there was large class sizes, and people weren't necessarily willing to put up their hands. So I thought it'd be interesting to have like either an app version of the clicker or a way for students to say they were confused, and then the prof could get a readout in real time. So we launched a couple months after I finished computer science. And then a few years later, we were acquired by an event app company. And so that was sort of the first entrepreneurship experience.
What kind of support did you have at U of T, kind of walking you through that venture? That takes an incredible amount of courage. An incredible amount of courage to go back for an undergrad. Like, I did not know that about you. That's just amazing. I'd say that is kind of one of the hallmarks of entrepreneurial spirit too, is just that resilience. And it's like, I'm going to get this done. I mean, I'll do what it takes. What were the supports at U of T? And then what was it about? What do you think kind of characterizes that canonical entrepreneur? And what were those skills that you had that really helped you be so successful?
Yes, I think there were a number of supports at U of T at the time. A lot of my professors in computer science were very helpful and wanted to help pilot the technology. And so that was helpful. I think part of it as an entrepreneur is that you see, this sounds corny, but like a different reality almost. Like, what if there was something that could help solve this problem that students face? And not waiting for someone else to come up with the solution and just sort of doing it yourself. And that's exciting. It's exciting to kind of come up with the idea. It's exciting to work on it, to work with people who have that challenge. So I think that's sort of a canonical part of it is to really be driven to help solve that problem for the people who face it.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do after you sold that business? And then how did you end up to where you are now?
So the company that acquired us, EventMobi, this was years ago, made event apps. And so my job at the time was actually a software developer. And so I led a team of 8 people developing mobile apps for events. And so it gave me, again, good hands-on experience doing software development. But I really wanted to get back into this intersection between sort of neuroscience, computer science, and medical science. And so after a couple of years, I started to reach out to people at U of T. And I asked, is there anyone that's working on anything that's interesting that intersects these 3 areas? And they introduced me to my co-founder, Frank Rudzik. And so I met with him in January 2015, and he had a lot of interesting ideas and projects, as many academics have a lot of irons in the fire. And so there was one specific project that really interested me. I thought it was had more short-term applications. And also thought it was a bit more practical, but also just like really intellectually interesting. And that was important to me. If I was going to spend years working on something, I really wanted to be interesting. So I connected with him. We did some back and forth. I was in sort of an interesting position that I had, we just had our first kid. We were fortunate at the time that we didn't own a house, so we had a bit of flexibility. But leaving a job and going to nothing was not a possibility. And so what I was able to do was work with him as an RA. But then I also taught some classes in the Department of Computer Science as well. And so I was able to do both of those at the same time. And that was really critical because those early years, we didn't really have funding, and we were still kind of evaluating how this technology was going to work and who was going to use it. So specifically, it was voice technology. And at the time, it was technology to extract about 800 different characteristics of someone's voice, so both the sound and the content. And then at the time, we were using it to figure out if someone effectively had Alzheimer's disease or not, based on those characteristics.
And how long did it take from when you started that venture to when you got bought out? What was that time frame like?
Yeah, I think that was about 7.5 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty typical. I think it's about 7 to 10 years before an exit.
Wow. And amazing that you were able to sustain yourself like that. And I'm curious of what does success look like in your job now? Is it new clients? Is it new, landing a big deal? Or is it really in the product development? Are you guys constantly iterating your product? Is it coming up with that exciting new application, or you have an idea of where the sector is going? What does success look like to you in your job?
Yes, I think like the basic answer is that I work for like a for-profit company, right? And so being able to land more deals, being able to expand your business is a big part of that success. But I think to get there, though, like you have to solve a problem that your clients have. And to do that, you really have to understand clinical research. You have to understand how clinical trials are run, and understand the pain points that they have. And so how can our technology really help not only the pharma companies running these trials, but also the patients that are in these trials as well. And so when you start to figure that out, when you start to check things off, for instance, in 2019, we realized we wanted to get beyond just measuring speech in people with dementia and go into psychiatry. And it took about 4 or 5 years until we had those studies set up, until we had the data collected, until we published in peer-reviewed journals, that we could actually go to a pharma company and say, look, we can now measure changes in speech and language and say schizophrenia. And that definitely felt like a success. And then closing our first deal with a pharma company and schizophrenia and those types of steps, I think were a big part of or what I felt was success.
One thing we always talk about in this podcast are skills, usually core competencies. Obviously, you use your technical skills. There's no question. Your comp sci degree, your neuroscience, that's a given. Talking about the soft skills or the core competencies that you use every day, what would you say are kind of your top skills that you honed in grad school that you're using on a daily basis and are so necessary for success in your role?
So there's several. One is, and this is something that I learned really quickly with my supervisor in grad school. When you're working with scientists and experts and people who often know a lot more than you about what you're talking about, is to choose your words very carefully, to be humble, to do the reading ahead of time, all those things. I mean, quite frankly, just not to say the stupid thing. And it sounds like really obvious, but I've worked with a lot of people who put their foot in their mouth, or I have worked with a lot of people like that in the past. And so I think that's sort of the first one, is just to be aware of who you're talking to, and choose your words carefully. I think the other one is just having those soft skills of working with a lot of different types of people. There's a lot of cultural differences between, say, a software developer and a salesperson. And so being able to, again, change your vocabulary, your style when you're working with these two sets of people, I think is really, really helpful. And the last one, and this is, like, again, aligns with grad school really well, is continuous learning. I think it's tempting to feel like you've reached a point in your career where you kind of understand how things work, but things are changing really rapidly, whether it's guidelines from the FDA, whether it's the technology that we use, or the different types of drugs being developed. And that just takes continuous learning and kind of pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone. I mean, I was reading about Bayesian statistics. I don't really remember doing a lot of that in grad school, but it's becoming more important in clinical trials. And so kind of pushing myself out of my comfort zone to kind of dig back into this. And you're often doing this, at like 9 o'clock at night, like after the kids are asleep. And so you just have to kind of keep on pushing yourself to kind of stay up on the latest technologies or protocols and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we hear a lot, repeated with our guests is you can figure things out.
Yeah.
In grad school, you're thrown into a situation, you're in a new therapeutic area of interest or area of study. You got to figure it out. You got to do the background literature review.
Yes.
You've got to, you learn how to learn. You learn how to research,
Yeah.
and as a result, whatever you're faced with in your career, you can figure it out. So it sounds like that's something that you really have taken from your grad studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also doing computer science too, like having that experience of starting and not being an expert at something and not knowing, and then going from, 0 to 100 and now knowing that, and you do that several times in grad school and beyond, and then you become just more confident with having that lack of knowledge and then figuring out how to gain that knowledge.
Are there other things that you did in grad school, or what was your time in grad school like? What was your specific thesis on? And what I would just love to know Liam as the grad student, and what did you take from that time?
Yeah.
Were you involved in extracurriculars, or what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so I was, as I alluded to earlier, I was working with a cognitive neurologist at Sunnybrook, and so I spent most of my time up at Sunnybrook, probably, let's say 4 days a week, and then a day or a day and a half downtown at classes. And so a lot of time was spent in the hospital, and I was actually administering this task to patients that were coming into the clinic. And so my supervisor would often have someone run down and say, like, hey, Liam, we have someone that can be a participant in your study, like, okay, come up right now. So it was important to be on site. And so I would come up and sometimes administer cognitive assessments, or sometimes do this eye task for measuring people's ability to effectively look in a different direction as like something that pops up. So they have to inhibit the urge to look at that thing that pops up and look in the opposite direction. And so using that task to gauge executive function. So I spent a lot of time in the hospital working with patients. And then on the side was when I was kind of increasingly learning how to code. And so often if it was just sort of like trivial things like, making a website, which was a bit more complicated back then, but not much. And then just learning how to build different applications and just kind of fill up my confidence level with software development. And then just doing fun stuff that you can do before you have kids, socializing, hanging out with people. But yeah, that was like the main things I was doing.
It sounds like a lot of your decisions were very intentional throughout your journey. Like, you made the purposeful decision to leave your not go on for your PhD and to switch degrees, and then very intentional steps along the way. Was there any serendipity, and can you describe those serendipitous events, like maybe meeting somebody that influenced you and helped change the course of your direction, or was it all just very intentional?
Yes and no. I mean, it wasn't like after I finished undergrad, I had this vision of being an entrepreneur in digital health. And so it's kind of one thing led to another. And there was things that I enjoyed doing day to day that I wanted to kind of do more of, and then things I didn't that I wanted to do less of. And so I kind of plotted a path that allowed me to do more of what I enjoyed. But it was also that pragmatic decision of the fact that most people in graduate school don't go into academia. And so figuring
Mhm.
out early on what was going to be that career, that job, if it was in academia, because I was sort of seeing the difficulties, the challenges that a lot of folks who are like really, really talented. They're publishing a lot, they're doing really well, and they're on postdoc number 2 or 3, and then even more complicated is if they have a spouse that's an academic as well. And so I didn't necessarily want to do that for the next 5 to 10 years, and that was a big motivator for switching to computer science, which was really practical, a lot of hands-on experience. And I thought that there's a lot of opportunities from a career perspective, especially combining what I learned in medical science and neuroscience. So looking back, it might seem like kind of like a seamless journey, but it was a bit more stochastic where, I was doing one thing for a while, and then I would double down on something that's a little bit different, and then kind of jump around, and then kind of asymptotically approach this career. So that was kind of roughly how it went. And I ended up with something that was rewarding by following that set of goals, which is working on things that you enjoy.
And going back to that time where you were making that punctuated, it sounds like you've always been a serial entrepreneur. You've always kind of had that bent of what can I do and how can I commercialize this? What were kind of those tipping points? And I can imagine there are a lot of grad students that have good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
What is that tipping point of I'm going to go and commercialize this versus playing it safe and keeping it, in the lab? What was that decision like for you? And what would you recommend to grad students that are in that position? What do they need to know in that moment to just kind of go for it? Because it takes a lot of motivation and courage to start something from an idea.
Yeah, I'd say for people, if they have a good idea, first validate that idea. Is it actually like a good idea? And often when you see peer-reviewed publications, like the first paragraph is sort of like the practical applications for the research. And in theory, a lot of that makes sense, but in practice, there's often blockers, especially in healthcare, in who's going to pay for this, how is it going to go through validation, et cetera, all these like actual real world blockers. And so those are things that you should figure out upfront, ideally. But ultimately, if you're not going to do it, it might not get done. And that's something that's surprising to a lot of people. You might look at companies out there and say, this thing is a natural fit for that pharma company or this digital health company. But they have their own roadmap, their own priorities, their own skill sets. And if you meet with them, they're not going to drop everything that they do and do what you're suggesting unless it aligns perfectly with something that they're already doing. And so with that thought in mind, if you really want to push something forward, if you have something that's going to help patients immensely or doctors or scientists, then sometimes you just have to start chipping away at it, whether it's small bits of validation, a few conversations here and there with people, and then kind of one thing leads to another. And again, if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. And so there's a lot of people that, you just want to see this through in the same way that like you want to finish school. It's just part of that process of seeing that complete.
Would you say it's more a huge appetite for risk, or is it a huge degree of confidence in being able to figure things out as you go along?
It's funny because
maybe a bit of both,
or neither.
Okay.
I don't have a huge appetite for risk, but the way that I look at it is, I think it's riskier to live life and regret all the things that you could have done, right? Like to me, that's a much bigger risk. And when I was younger, I didn't have those financial risks. And so it's easy for me just to drop my job and do something else. When you have a mortgage, it's much more difficult, and it is much more financially risky to do that. And so you have to figure out how to make that work. But a lot of people are in grad school, they don't own a house yet. Their living expenses are relatively low. They can, have a job as an RA and also on the side be working on other things. And so I think you're in a unique position in grad school, and it absolutely doesn't feel like this when you're in grad school, but you have a lot more free time than you will when you have kids or when you're older. And so really kind of take advantage of that extra free time to kind of explore some of these ideas. And I think, to your point, because you get so used to solving problems in grad school, that this is just another set of problems. And there's never been a time where it's been easier to learn how to do something novel, like whether it's Google searches, a library, ChatGPT, et cetera. Like there's all sorts of different tools you can use. And then just talking to the people around you. I mean, U of T is not known for commercializing technologies. That's not necessarily our strength, but there are a lot of people who have in the community, and there's H2I, Creative Destruction Lab. So there's lots of people that grad students can use to figure out what the next steps are, what the course is for commercializing something.
I can imagine your path would be very different had you taken it today versus when you did, with coding, with comp sci, with, the technical side of what you're doing, starting a business now with AI.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say it's easier? Are the conditions more ripe for entrepreneurs now? Or is it more competitive because now everyone can kind of come up with great ideas and execute at a very quickly and efficiently.
Yes, I think some of the barriers have been reduced, which means that there are more people that can do it. So writing code is substantially easier now than it was 15 years ago, like leaps and bounds easier. So definitely more people can do it, but you still have some of the same barriers that you had 15, 20, 30 years ago. To make an app or something that a physician uses, you still have to do the same things now that you had to do 20 years ago. So it's not just creating the app, which is often the trivial part, and even back then when it was more difficult, but also just the validation, going through the hospital IRB or REB board to get approval to do this, figuring out, who's going to work with you, meeting with different physicians. Often they're not necessarily interested in what you're working on. Some are, but maybe they don't have the time to do it. And so there's still those barriers that you have to work through, and ultimately have to figure out, are people going to use this? Is it solving a problem that people have? Like, what's the go-to-market plan? How do I get funding? All those things are still problems that you face now. And it might be easier to get funding now because there's a lot more venture capital coming to Toronto than there was 15 years ago. So that part is better, but it's not super easy. And especially the market right now it's harder to raise money from what I've heard than it was, say, in 2022 or 2021.
Would you do it again? Or what can you see yourself doing if you weren't doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, it seems so inevitable that it is like hard to say. But definitely working within medical science. Like, I like the combination of having like interesting technical problems, but also just like helping real people and solving real problems. Not just doing things in technology where you're increasing people's click rate, or that doesn't motivate me personally. And so medical science feels more important to me. It feels like a bigger set of problems that can potentially help a lot of people. So I would be, I think, working in the same area. And I have a number of family members within medicine too. And so all these things have become motivating factors.
What do you think are the biggest questions in medtech right now? In maybe the next 5 years, is there some holy grail in medtech, or where is the sector going?
Yeah, I think a few things. In 2020 and 2021, there was a lot of funding that came in during COVID. So like a huge spike in venture capital. There was a lot of companies that were created, and a lot of what they were developing was just hype. And so it wasn't even necessarily that they didn't work, but it was more hype that the company would succeed. And so they might have had like a digital therapeutic or a diagnostic or a cognitive assessment, but ultimately it didn't fit into the healthcare system as is. And so figuring out where digital health fits, I think, is still a thing that needs to be resolved. And in some situations, like, you see a clear fit, but there's still a lot of companies out there that are still kind of searching for that bigger opportunity and figuring out how to fit into a landscape, how to validate what the qualifications are from the FDA. A lot of those things are still being figured out right now, like both by the FDA, Health Canada, by the companies that are bringing these technologies to market. So that's still ongoing. I mean, obviously, AI is a big area, and exactly how that's going to fit into clinical practice. There's a lot of areas like ambient scribes, which are growing very rapidly, but it's unclear if it's going to be one of these like rapidly growing companies or a company like Epic that just adds it to their software and website, all these existing companies. And so it'll be interesting to see whether, I think, like right now, it's sort of like a Cambridge explosion of AI companies that have come to the market. So whether it's going to be one of these new companies or one of the existing companies that just kind of adds AI. And so that's definitely something to watch, is just how that unfolds.
And are the majority of clients of Cambridge Cognition Canadian, US, and what are the unique challenges for the Canadian market? Because I can imagine there are many.
Yeah.
Can you describe that a bit?
Yeah, so our customers are pharma companies, biotech, life sciences. The majority, 50-60 of them, 56% are based in the US. The remaining are UK, France, Switzerland, Germany. So we don't have many large biotech pharma companies here, especially within neuroscience. And so again, the business is outside of Canada. I think that's generally true of health tech companies. The market in Canada is so much smaller And so even if you are selling to a hospital, there's just many more hospitals in the US than there are in Canada. So that there are a lot of barriers in Canada to commercialize, but it is easy to take a flight to go to the States or Europe. There's a lot of opportunities in these different countries for commercializing technology. There's different regulatory concerns, privacy and security. This is definitely a concern, especially if you're using AI, especially if you're using third-party services. That's a big part of the process when selling to pharma. So I was telling you about my day-to-day experiences, and one of them is when you are weeks away from closing a deal, maybe months, you get a request for information or an RFI. So it can be 400 different questions on your security procedures, type of AI you use, et cetera. And so all those things are significant barriers when you're significant challenges when you're doing work with PHI or personalized identifiable information, et cetera.
Do you think that, I guess there's this misperception, and maybe it isn't a misperception, but it is to somebody outside the sector, like I am, that Canada is just not the right environment for these, for companies to take off. You gotta be in Silicon Valley, you gotta be in that concentration, you gotta be in the environment where everyone's kind of celebrating failure and putting yourself out there. In Canada, we're just so much more conservative and not really good at celebrating failure. Do you think that companies can succeed in Canada, staying in Canada, or is it inevitable that you have to kind of go outside the Canadian market to really thrive?
I think so. Can they succeed as a Canadian company internationally versus can they succeed in Canada? Yeah. I think Canada alone, probably not for most companies. And the reason I say that is because if you're getting venture capital, a VC wants to see you become 10 times bigger. And that's hard to do in a smaller market. And so I think it's sort of simple math that you need a bigger market to be able to succeed. If you have 10% of a small market, that's even smaller. 10% of a massive market is still pretty big. And so I think there's still that need to be able to sell into those markets, but I don't think you need to move.
You don't need to, that's what I was getting at. Do you think you need to be in Canada? You have obviously international clients, but can you stay in Canada and succeed? Or do you have to kind of ship out?
I mean, a lot of our competitors were based in the States, and they didn't have a natural competitive edge from what we saw. I think there's differences between, say, a European company, though, and a company in North America. Like we have seen that biotech companies in, say, the US are more likely to work with us versus some of our EU competitors and vice versa. So I think there are some cultural differences, like people might be more likely to hire someone that sounds like they're of a similar accent or beliefs. I think the bigger problem isn't can you keep your company in Canada, it's can you create your company in Canada. It's very different culturally. A lot of physicians here, it's almost a faux pas starting a company. Whereas a lot of like the VCs I meet in the US have medical degrees, like from prestigious institutions, and they could have done whatever they wanted, but it was like a no-brainer for them to go into industry or become a VC. And I don't meet a lot of Canadian physicians from like really top schools that decide to go into industry. It doesn't seem as normal. And I know that U of T is second to Harvard in terms of publications, but not in terms of commercialization. I think we're maybe the top 100. And so I think the bigger problem is just changing that culture around waiting for someone else to do it versus I'm going to go out there and just do it myself. And some of that is funding. There's not as much angel funding. Some of that is risk aversion. Some of that is just doing things where you're making money seems kind of beneath you versus like the virtuous like academic pursuit. I think it's too bad because if you want to see your invention, your ideas get out there, ultimately you have to figure out how to commercialize it, or someone does. And sometimes you doing it yourself is the biggest time.
Yeah, I feel like this is a conversation we had with our venture capital guest. It's, you got to build the environment slowly, and it is coming slowly. I think you're seeing way more VC in Toronto. Yeah. You're seeing way more startups. It's just, they get to a point and then they go to the States. more money, more capital,
Yeah.
higher appetite for risk. Maybe regulations too. I mean, we're a very regulatory country, and especially in the medical. Socialized medicine almost demands that. So it might be easier, the thresholds are lower for the regulatory aspect of businesses in other countries. Is that a fair
Maybe.
statement?
I mean, I wouldn't, like, compared to EU, probably not. Like, I think we're probably less. Yeah. It's the same or less. But in terms of the US, like, there are a lot of different regulations because there's 50 different states. And so you might come up with a business that you can launch in Florida, but not in New York, for instance, because there's just different rules. Like, one of the rules is, I think, physicians, like, you can't have a corporation that employs physicians or something like that. There's some rules around medical businesses. And so in some places you actually have like a group practice that you subcontract to. So there's a lot of kind of nuance and rules that might be state specific. And so those things are kind of unique, whereas in Canada, like, we have far fewer shots on goals because there's fewer provinces, and there's only a few that have a big enough population to really merit the effort of a startup.
So Liam, what do you like most about what you do?
Solving significant problems. I mean, doing something that will hopefully matter day to day. I think it is incredibly rewarding. I heard recently at a local oncology, or not a local oncology conference, but a big oncology conference that was in the States, that there was a new therapy that increased life by, I think it was like it doubled the lifespan. And the scientists that were presenting this data got a standing ovation. And like, that type of developments is just incredible. And now we were part of that trial, but being part of trials that have a significant impact on patients and being able to point to your assessment, your technology, and say that can help make that decision to move that drug forward. And now it's actually helping people is really exciting.
And what would you say is the hardest part of your job?
The timescales. Like, the timescales are just almost insane in this industry. I mean, to put in perspective, in 2015, we first pitched a large pharma company. We didn't close that deal until 2017, so it took 2 full years. Now, as a more established company, it takes us about 9 months to close the deal. And then once you have the deal closed, I mean, some of these clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease take years to run. And so you can close it, say, in 2026 and not get a read until 2029. After creating a new product and you have to wait 3 years to find out if your product works, that's excruciating. It's really hard to develop something and iterate quickly in an environment. And so you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to be able to think ahead, like, what are things that we can do in the interim to enhance the product? Are there other avenues to iterate to move quickly? And so that can be like tricky, like, if you have a vision that you think will help expand the business. But ultimately, you have to hold your breath, wait for 3 to 4
You
years.
gotta be a patient person. Do you stagger your products so that they're in different stages of the life cycle, so that you're not holding your breath for too long, that you're able to kind of devote your time to other things while you're waiting for those trials to...
Yeah, and I think part of how we did that was having multiple irons in the fire. The problem is, part of the advice you get as an entrepreneur is don't do too much, like, focus on a few things. But the challenge within our space is, let's say you're developing a new test for schizophrenia. It could easily take 5 years before you have a publication that supports its efficacy, that it works. And it could also take 2 years, it could take 7 years. You don't really know. You don't necessarily have control over the full process. And so sometimes having 2 different programs that run in parallel means that you might have one that reads out sooner, that you can sort of commercialize and get feedback sooner. So I think there is value in having a few different programs, especially with these extremely long timelines.
Yeah, it's just like being in the lab.
Yeah.
You have multiple projects going at once because one's going to pan out sooner than the other, and you just got to hedge your bets that one of them is going to work. So throw a bunch of irons in the fire.
And sometimes you don't know until you start to do it, and sometimes you have a pharma company that reaches out and says, we are really interested in like dementia of Lewy bodies, or Lewy body dementia, and like, do you have technology that applies to that? And like, well, this could be a fit for it as you start going down that pathway. So some of it is a bit optimistic, waiting for that right moment. And so just having your technology advance enough so that when these new opportunities comes up,
you can pivot it quickly. Yeah. So going back to Liam as a grad student, what advice, knowing the infinite wisdom that you have now, all you've been through, everything you've done, the life that you've led, what would you tell Liam in grad school that you think would be essential information for him at that stage in his life?
So I think I didn't have great awareness of what happens outside of academia. I knew about pharma companies. I never worked with one. I knew about some of the jobs in hospitals, but all this was very superficial. Was very vague. What I would have done if I could go back was when I go to these scientific conferences, many of these conferences have people from industry that also present posters. And so using that opportunity just to walk up to them, ask them about the poster, ask them if you can connect for coffee or a quick Teams call, just to get feedback on their path. Like, how did they get to their current position, and then start to fill in the blanks for yourself. And just do reading about these different opportunities, whether it is pharma or digital health company or a regulator or whatever. There are lots of opportunities, but it's not obvious to someone who was in academia for so long.
You just gave us a great pitch for our podcast, ChatGPD. You pretty much described why we started it. It is just to bring that awareness. I think it's so important, and you have brought such great awareness to your world, entrepreneurship, pharma, business, science, the overlapping Venn diagrams of them all. So thank you so much for the information that you've shared. We've come to the end of our time, but we do a fun little thing with all of our guests that I forgot to warn you about. Sorry, Liam. we just, in 1 minute, if you can pitch your career to our listeners, why should they consider being an entrepreneur and a principal at a company that they have founded?
I think the biggest reason is being able to have impact. And so producing publications is incredibly important for disseminating information, but being able to take the next step and being able to see people actually use that invention or that discovery, and being able to see people improve their lives or get better is tremendous.
Thanks, Liam. It's been great having you here today.
Thank you for having me.